What happens when the most feared man in the country discovers his new wife's hidden scars and realizes the monster she survived wasn't him? A 20-year-old woman, a mafia boss who rules through fear, and a wedding night that neither of them will ever forget. If you've ever wondered what it feels like when a predator becomes a protector, stay until the end. This story will stay with you long after it's over. Drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The church was full of people who were afraid to leave. That was the truest thing Lillian Hart could say about her own wedding. The guests sat in white-draped pews wearing their finest clothes and their most practiced smiles, and not one of them, not the city councilman in the third row, not the federal judge near the back, not the three men who controlled the eastern docks, was there because they wanted to celebrate. They were there because Damien Moreau had invited them, and nobody in Crestfall City declined an invitation from Damien Moreau. Lillian stood at the back of the aisle in a dress that cost more than her father's first car, and she could not feel her hands. She had tried to eat that morning, managed half a piece of toast before the nausea one. Her maid of honor, a woman she had met exactly twice, hired by her father for appearances, had done her makeup with practiced efficiency and called her beautiful without once looking at her eyes. The dress had been fitted 3 weeks earlier by a seamstress who worked in silence the entire time, her mouth full of pins, her eyes professionally empty. Lillian had stood on the fitting platform with her arms slightly raised and her gaze fixed on the far wall, and thought about how this was exactly the kind of obedience she had spent 20 years perfecting. Be still. Don't fidget. Don't take up too much space. Her father appeared at her elbow at precisely the right moment, as he always did, his timing as flawless as his charcoal suit. "You look lovely," Randall Hart said. He wasn't looking at her either. He was scanning the room the way a man checks his investment portfolio. Calculating, proprietary, satisfied with the numbers. His hand found her arm and wrapped around it at the exact angle that looked like tenderness from 30 feet away and felt like a vice grip from 0 inches. Lillian's spine went straight automatically. Her chin came up. Her expression smoothed into the particular blankness she had learned to wear when she needed to get through something without falling apart. "Thank you, Father," she said. The organ began. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm and tried to see Damien Moreau clearly. She'd met him twice before today. Both times had been brief, formal, almost bureaucratic. Handshakes and polite conversation in her father's study, while the men around them discussed terms as though she weren't in the room. She hadn't minded that, oddly. Being invisible had its advantages. She'd had more time to watch him. He was not what she'd expected when her father first said the name. She'd built a picture from whispers, the rumors that filtered down even to someone as isolated as her. Damien Moreau, 51 years old. Ran the Moreau Syndicate for 23 years after inheriting it from a father who'd reportedly been just as feared and significantly less controlled. Politicians returned his calls before anyone else's. 3 rival family heads had made the mistake of underestimating him in the past decade. None of them were relevant anymore. The stories ranged from brutal to almost mythological depending on who was telling them. What she'd seen in her father's study was a tall man with gray at his temples and very still eyes. He'd sat across from Randall Hart and spoken quietly and never raised his voice once. That was the detail that stuck with her. Every man with power that Lillian had ever encountered used their voice as a weapon. Loud, sudden, unpredictable, designed to keep you permanently off balance. Damien Moreau had spoken to her father in the same tone you might use to explain directions, and something about that quiet had been more unnerving than any shouting. She reached the altar. He was looking at her now, and she made herself hold it for exactly 2 seconds before dropping her gaze. Old reflex. Direct eye contact had never been safe in her life. The ceremony moved the way ceremonies do when everyone in the room has somewhere else they'd rather be. Efficiently, without genuine emotion, the words performing their function. Lillian repeated what she was told to repeat. She felt the ring slide onto her finger. She heard the officiant's voice and her own voice, and the ambient sound of several hundred people breathing, and somewhere underneath all of it, very far down, the part of her that had survived 20 years of her father's house was doing the only thing it knew how to do, counting. Minutes until this part ends. Steps until the door. Distance between where she was and where she would have to be next. The reception was worse, in the way that things requiring sustained performance are always worse than the thing you've been dreading. Lillian sat beside her husband. Her husband, the word sat in her chest like a stone, and smiled at the right moments and answered questions in the right number of words. She ate 4 bites of food she could not taste. She drank 1 glass of champagne and stopped because she needed to stay sharp. Around her, the city's most dangerous and well-dressed people moved through a ballroom strung with soft light, and the noise of it pressed against her like something physical. Damien sat beside her for most of the evening. He didn't demand conversation. He didn't seem to need it. He talked to the men who approached the table, and there was a steady stream of them, a hierarchy she could feel even if she couldn't name its ranks, with the same unhurried precision she'd noticed before. His hand never touched her unnecessarily. When he did speak to her directly, the questions were simple. Was her water glass full? Was the temperature comfortable? Did she want anything? She answered each time with a small no and a small thank you. He looked at her once, after the 3rd or 4th time, with an expression she couldn't decode. Not suspicion, not impatience, something quieter than either. He looked away again before she could decide what it was. Her father found her near the end of the evening, in the brief window when Damien was pulled into a conversation with a cluster of men who all had the wide shoulders and careful eyes of people in the security business. Randall materialized at her side the way he always did, smooth and sudden and smelling of expensive cologne, and took her hand in both of his. "You've done very well," he said quietly. "I'm proud of you." Lillian felt the familiar cold move through her. Praise from her father had never meant what it was supposed to mean. It meant she had been useful. It meant she had performed correctly, and the performance had served him. She would have preferred silence. "Thank you, Father." "He's a serious man," Randall continued, his voice staying low, his eyes moving over the room. "Treat him with respect. Don't make him wait for things. Don't make him ask twice." He paused. "You know how to behave." The way he said it carried everything he'd ever said before it. Every lesson, every consequence, every carefully worded instruction that had been enforced with something much harder than words. "I know," she said. He squeezed her hands once and let go, and Lillian stood in the center of her own wedding reception and focused on keeping her breathing even. She knew how to behave. She had been learning nothing else her entire life. The car that took them to the Moreau estate was large and black and silent, driven by a man named Marcus, who Lillian had been told was one of Damien's longest-serving people. She sat in the back with her husband and watched the city pass through tinted glass. The streets of Crestfall moved by in fragments. Streetlights, the dark geometry of buildings, the occasional figure on a sidewalk who had no idea what was rolling past them. Damien sat with his jacket still on, his tie loosened exactly 1 degree, watching the road. Lillian counted her heartbeats. She was trying to keep them from getting out of hand. She had been telling herself all day that she knew what was coming, that knowing would make it easier. This was simply another thing to get through, the way everything had always been simply another thing to get through. She was good at that. She had perfected the particular skill of evacuating herself from her own body when she needed to, going somewhere smaller and quieter behind her own eyes, until whatever was happening was finished. It would be fine. She would get through it. The estate appeared at the end of a long private drive, and even through the numbness she registered it. A house that operated on a scale that suggested intimidation was partially architectural. Stone and iron and carefully controlled darkness broken by lit windows. The grounds were immaculate in a way that spoke of permanent staff rather than weekend upkeep. 2 men at the gate who moved with the economy of people who had done this long enough to stop thinking about it. Inside, the house was quieter than she expected. She'd imagined something more overtly threatening. She wasn't sure why. Some leftover piece of the mythology she'd been carrying. Instead, it was just a house. Large, expensive, carefully ordered, the kind of space that had been designed for function as much as impression. A woman named Helen, who managed the domestic staff, met them inside and was brisk and efficient and completely unbothered by the circumstances of her employer bringing home a wife, which Lillian found oddly steadying. Helen showed her where things were with the directness of someone who would rather give information than withhold it, and then disappeared without ceremony. Damien walked her to the room. The master bedroom was large, a fireplace along one wall, a bed the size of something geological. The curtains were already drawn, and someone had lit the fire, and the room held a warmth that Lillian might have called comfortable under any other circumstances. She stood near the door because she wasn't sure what else to do and waited. He was moving at no particular speed, shrugging off his jacket, hanging it with the care of someone who respected his own things. He loosened his tie the rest of the way. He was not looking at her, and she couldn't tell if that was deliberate or indifferent. "You can take the bathroom first," he said. "There should be whatever you need in there. Helen handles the supplies." Lillian nodded. Her voice had gone somewhere unreachable, so she nodded again and moved toward the bathroom. And this was the moment she had been most afraid of. Crossing that distance, walking through a room toward a door, with a man like him behind her. She focused on her feet, one and then the other. She kept her shoulders from pulling in, which took active effort. The bathroom was as large as some rooms she'd lived in. She found what she needed without having to look hard. The space was organized with a precision that felt like a second language. Everything in its right place, nothing extraneous. She washed her face and took off the jewelry that had been settled on her by the wedding stylist and stood in front of the mirror for a moment. She looked like herself. This surprised her. She had expected to look different on the other side of today. She changed into the nightgown she'd brought, pale silk, modest, the kind of thing her father's household had determined was appropriate, and stood for a moment with her hand on the bathroom door. Then she opened it and went back into the bedroom. She was not expecting what came next. What happened was simple and terrifying in its simplicity. She moved toward the bed, and the arrangement of her nightgown shifted, and the silk slipped at her shoulder, and before she could catch it, before she could move fast enough, the fabric rode up across her back for just a second. A second was enough. She yanked it back immediately. The whole movement took perhaps 2 seconds, but he had been looking by then, and he had seen. The silence in the room changed. It was the same air, the same fire, the same furniture. But the quality of his stillness was different now. She could feel it the way you can feel a shift in pressure before a storm, something atmospheric and wrong. She pulled the nightgown straight and kept moving toward the bed and told herself to breathe, and told herself to keep moving, and told herself, stop. Not loud, not sharp, just that one word placed very carefully into the silence. Lillian stopped. She did not turn around. "Come here," he said. She turned around. He was standing near the fireplace, and his face was different. Not angry. That was the thing that confused her, because she was fluent in angry, and she could read it from across a room. This was something else. His jaw had tightened. His eyes had the quality of something that had just been shown information it wasn't expecting to have. She walked toward him. He didn't move towards her. He waited for her to come to him, and when she was close enough, he said very quietly, "Turn around." Every nerve in her body sent up the same signal, the kind of fear that doesn't broadcast itself but instead takes up total residence. The fear of someone who has learned that what comes after a command is always worse than the command itself. She turned around. She felt his hands, careful, unhurried, move the silk aside. Not reckless, not rough. Deliberate in the way that someone handling something broken might be deliberate, with a consciousness about the damage already done. The nightgown moved enough. The firelight was enough. She heard his breath change, a sound she recognized not because she had heard it from him, but because she had heard it from herself, in bathrooms, in dark rooms, late at night. The sound of someone taking in something that is very hard to take in and forcing themselves to do it anyway. Not shock exactly. More like the specific intake of breath you use when you need to contain something that would otherwise show itself in a way you cannot afford. He let the fabric go. She turned back around on her own. She didn't know what else to do. His eyes were on her face, and something had settled in them. Not settled like calm settles, but settled like a decision settles, quiet and complete and pointing only in one direction. "How old were you?" he said. It wasn't a question designed for an answer. The way he phrased it was the question of someone who already knows that the number will be an obscenity. Her mouth opened and closed. You don't have to tell me," he said. The fire popped. Outside, somewhere on the grounds, one of his security rotations moved through its pattern, and she could hear the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel through the window glass. He moved to the closet and came back with a robe. It was heavy wool, large, built for him. He held it out toward her. She stared at it. "Take it," he said. "You're cold." She hadn't noticed she was cold. She took the robe and put it on. It swallowed her completely. Her hands disappeared into the sleeves, the hem hit the floor. It smelled like cedar and something darker she couldn't name. "Take the bed," Damien said. She looked at him. "I have work," he said, and the way he said it was not an explanation. It was a door, held open, giving her somewhere to put her gaze that wasn't his face. A courtesy, she realized distantly. He was offering her a way to accept without having to process what was happening. "Okay," she managed. He crossed to the desk in the corner of the room and opened a laptop. He didn't look at her again. She stood for a moment in his robe in the center of the room, and then she moved to the bed and got in on the far side and lay still, and the fire went on burning, and he went on working, and the silence between them was not the silence she had spent 20 years being afraid of. She didn't know what it was. She lay on her side with her knees drawn up and watched the fire and tried to parse it. This room, this man, the particular tone of his voice when he'd said, "Take the bed," the way he'd held out the robe with his jaw still tight and his eyes still doing that contained thing. Her father had never once given her something without wanting something back. That was the only framework she had, and it wasn't fitting. She closed her eyes because she couldn't keep them open anymore, and the fire made its small sounds, and somewhere in the room a man who frightened entire governments sat at a desk and did not come near her, and Lillian Hart fell asleep for the first time in months without lying awake first, waiting for the sound of footsteps in the hall. She fell asleep confused, and confused, for her, was so much better than afraid. The weeks that followed had their own strange rhythm. The Moreau estate ran on a schedule that was almost military in its consistency. Staff arrived and moved through their routines at the same hours each day. Meals appeared in the dining room with the predictability of tides. Security rotations operated with a precision she could time if she wanted to. There was order here, the functional kind, and Lillian, who had lived her entire life under order of a very different kind, found herself watching it with a cautious attention she could not entirely explain. Damien was present and largely elsewhere at the same time. He ate breakfast early, usually alone. She learned this by accident on the third morning when she came down earlier than usual and found him at the end of the long table with coffee and a newspaper. And he looked up without surprise and told her there was food on the sideboard. She served herself and sat, and they ate without speaking, and it was not uncomfortable, which confused her because silence in her experience had always carried weight. He left the house most mornings by 8, returned at variable hours. Sometimes she heard his car in the early afternoon. Sometimes it was late, past 11, and she would be in her room. They slept in the same bed by some unspoken negotiation of space that left her half and him half, with a distance between that he never crossed, reading by lamplight when she heard the house settle around his return. He didn't explain his schedule. He didn't account for his hours. That was another thing that confused her, because every powerful man she had encountered had expected their movements to be anticipated and accommodated, and Damien Moreau moved through his own house as though his time was simply his. He never asked her to do anything. This was the most disorienting part. In her father's house, there had always been an assigned function, a role, an expectation, a way of being useful that kept you safe. She had built her entire operational intelligence around knowing what was needed before it was asked, staying ahead of the requirement, never being caught without the right answer. Here, there were no requirements. Helen ran the household with complete competence and didn't need assistance. The cook handled meals. The staff handled everything the staff handled. Lillian had nothing to do, and the nothing felt like a test she didn't know how to pass. She started small. She found the library on the 4th day, a room she'd walked past twice without stopping, which said something about the degree to which she'd been managing her own exposure to the house, keeping to the minimum footprint. The library had floor-to-ceiling shelves and 2 leather chairs near a window, and enough books that she could spend a year in here without running out, which struck her as a kind of abundance she'd never considered before. She took a book. She took it back to her room and read it. The next day she went back for another. On the 7th day, Damien appeared in the library doorway while she was there. She startled. She hated that she startled. The whole body reflex, the book almost dropping, the breath that went in too fast. She'd been working on it for years. It still happened. "Sorry," she said immediately. "I should have asked." "Why?" he said. She blinked. "It's a library," he said. "Take whatever you want." He moved to one of the shelves and found what he came for without looking at her again, and left. She stood with her heart going too fast and her book in her hands and tried to calibrate what had just happened against every system she had for understanding what men wanted. She couldn't make it fit. She began to notice the way he watched her. Not in the way she was used to being watched. Not evaluating, not hunting for errors, not measuring the performance against an expected outcome. He watched the way someone watches something they're trying to understand without disturbing it. She caught it first at dinner, one of the evenings they ate together. His gaze moving to her hands when she reached for her water glass and staying there for a half-second longer than casual. She caught it again when she crossed through the main hallway one afternoon and heard him on a phone call in the adjacent room, and he paused in his sentence. She heard the pause. As she passed the doorway, she caught it on a Wednesday morning when she accidentally broke a glass in the kitchen. She'd reached past the counter edge, misjudging the distance. The glass went off the edge, and it shattered on the tile, and she was on her knees picking up pieces before the sound had finished echoing because this was automatic. This was survival instinct at a cellular level. Break something, clean it up before anyone sees, never leave evidence. She didn't hear him come in. She was reaching for a large shard when he crouched down at the edge of her periphery, not reaching, not grabbing anything, just present, at her level. She snapped upright and the adrenaline went everywhere and she said, "I'm sorry, I'll clean it up. I'm so sorry." "It's a glass," he said. His voice was the same it always was. Quiet. No edge. She was still breathing too fast. She could feel it. He didn't move. He stayed crouched at the same level and let the silence run, and didn't reach toward her and didn't raise his voice and didn't fill the space with anything until her breathing started to slow down on its own. "You cut your hand," he said. She looked down. She had. A thin line across 2 fingers, barely anything, but bleeding. "Come on," he said. He led her to the small bathroom off the main hallway and found a first aid kit under the sink with the same ease he found everything in this house. He knew exactly where everything lived and cleaned the cuts without asking permission, but without being rough either. He used antiseptic and small bandages and said nothing through any of it. She sat on the counter edge and watched his hands and thought, this man runs an organization that dispenses violence as a business function. She had no doubt about what he was. She had never had any doubt about what he was. And he was using more care on 2 shallow cuts on her fingers than anyone had used on her in 20 years. She didn't know what to do with that. "You don't have to apologize for breaking things," he said. He wasn't looking at her face. He was finishing with the second bandage. "Okay," she said. "In this house," he said, "you don't have to apologize for things that are accidents." She heard the precision in that. In this house. Not everywhere. Not as a universal principle. Specifically here. "Okay," she said again, because it was the only word that felt safe. He put the first aid kit back under the sink and washed his hands and looked at her then, directly for a moment, the gray eyes doing that thing where they held more information than they gave. "Go finish your book," he said. She went and finished her book, and she sat in the library chair with the afternoon light coming through the window and her bandaged fingers marking her page. And she thought about a man who'd taken her wedding night and turned it into nothing, who'd handed her a robe and given her the bed, who'd said it's just a glass about a broken glass, and you don't have to apologize for accidents, and go finish your book. She thought about her father. She thought about the difference between the kind of power that needed you to be afraid of it to function, and the kind that didn't seem to need anything from you at all. And she didn't know what to do with that difference, but she felt it. She felt it the way you feel sunlight for the first time after a long time spent in a room with no windows, with suspicion, with gratitude, with a fear that it will stop. She turned the page and kept reading and tried not to want it too much. Damien was not unaware that he was watching her. He was aware of it the way he was aware of most things, with the particular precision of a man who had spent 3 decades in an environment where imprecision had consequences. He noticed things. It was the mechanism that had kept him alive and operational in a world that disposed of the inattentive. He had noticed, in those early weeks, everything. The apologies. They came before she'd had time to determine if an apology was warranted, reflexive, anticipatory, inserted into interactions the way a person flinches before the blow lands rather than after. He'd heard her apologize for being in the hallway, for taking too long in the bathroom, for laughing, once, briefly, at something the cook had said, and then cutting it off like she'd caught herself doing something dangerous. He'd noticed the way she held herself in rooms where he was present, smaller than her actual size, pulled in, occupying a minimum of space. The way she positioned herself near exits without appearing to do it consciously. The way she tracked the distance between herself and whoever else was present, and adjusted for it, and had a permanent awareness of that number running in the background of whatever else she was doing. He'd noticed that she never asked for anything. Not food, not books, until she found the library, and even then she'd been startled into apologizing for it. Not more blankets, even in the early weeks when the house ran cold at night, and he'd seen her at breakfast with the particular pinched quality of someone who'd been uncomfortable. Not help when she broke the glass, not acknowledgement of any kind. She had no practice receiving things. He recognized this, not from his own experience, but from something older, from the years he'd spent watching people, reading the specific vocabulary of bodies and behavior that his particular world required you to learn or die from not knowing. He'd seen it in people who'd survived certain kinds of captivity, not the kind with physical restraints, the invisible kind, the kind that left no evidence except in the way a person moved through rooms. He'd started asking careful questions on the second week, not of her, of people he trusted, in places where truth was currency and reputation could be verified. He had resources for this that most people didn't. The kind of information infrastructure that comes from 23 years of building relationships in every layer of a city, from the highest floors to the lowest, including the layers that dealt specifically in things people tried to keep quiet. Randall Hart had tried very hard to keep things quiet. The file that came back to Damien on a Thursday evening was thorough. He sat alone in his office with the door closed and read it once all the way through. Then he set it down and sat without moving for a period of time that he didn't track. Outside his window, the grounds were dark, the security rotation moving its patient circle, the lights of the house casting their familiar geometry across the lawns. He'd sat in this room for 23 years and made decisions that determined other people's fates, and he was not a man who confused sentiment for strategy. He read the file again. Lillian Hart, 20 years old, homeschooled through age 16 under conditions that limited all external contact. 2 emergency room visits before she was 13, documented as accidents by a father who arrived with the right effect and the right story, and apparently enough established civic presence that the right questions didn't get asked with any particular energy. A 3rd visit at 17 that was documented under a different category but had been flagged, once, by a hospital social worker whose report was filed and then seemingly did nothing. Teachers, the ones she'd had access to before the homeschooling, remembered her as quiet, intelligent, exceptionally good at being unnoticed. One, located through a secondary contact, had described her as the most careful child she'd ever taught, and said it with the specific sadness of someone who had understood something and not been able to do anything with it. Randall Hart, 61 years old, real estate development, civic committees, philanthropic boards, the kind of photo-documented generosity that builds a public self designed to be inspected. 3 marriages. Lillian was from the first wife, who had died when Lillian was 7. Circumstances noted, no conclusions drawn in the public record. The secondary sources were less neutral. Damien closed the file. He thought about the wedding night, the silk moving, the 2 seconds that had shifted everything. He had seen scarring before in his life. He ran an organization where violence was a functional tool, and he was not naive about what human bodies looked like when they had sustained damage over time. But what he had seen on her back in the firelight was not the evidence of a single event. It was a history, a documented record spanning years, written in a language that required no translation. He thought about her at breakfast with her hands folded in her lap, her voice when she apologized, the way she'd been on the kitchen floor reaching for glass before she'd registered that she wasn't being watched. He thought about Randall Hart, who would be calling soon to ask how his daughter was settling in. He'd already called twice. Damien had taken both calls. Randall was charming on the phone, articulate, warm in the calibrated way of men who need warmth to be a tool. He asked after Lillian with exactly the right amount of paternal concern, and not so much that it became pressure. He was good at it. Damien sat in his office until past midnight. Then he made a phone call of his own, not about Randall Hart. Not yet. That particular clock could tick at whatever pace he chose. He had learned a long time ago that urgency was for people who didn't control their own timeline. The call was about something else entirely. He spoke for 10 minutes and then hung up, and then he turned off the light in his office and he went upstairs. He stood in the hallway outside the bedroom door for a moment. Inside, on the far side of the bed, his wife of 3 weeks was asleep. He knew because the strip of light under the door was off. She turned the lamp off before midnight, every night, with a consistency that suggested sleep came relatively easily for her here, which was the only good piece of information he had taken from the entire last 3 weeks. He opened the door carefully and moved to his side of the room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. She didn't stir. He sat there for a while. He was not a man who wasted time on things he could not change. The past was an intelligence briefing, something you read to understand the present, not to mourn. But there were moments in this line of work, occasional and arriving without warning, when the weight of the specific thing in front of you demanded a moment before you moved to the next position. He took the moment. Then he lay down on his side of the bed, in the dark, listening to his wife breathe, and began making plans. Across the city, in a penthouse that looked like money and felt like something else, Randall Hart poured himself a drink and thought about his daughter. He was not worried, precisely. Lillian was well trained. She knew what was expected of her. She would be what she needed to be for Damien Moreau. And Damien Moreau would continue to be the most powerful set of connections that Randall Hart had ever managed to acquire. And the arrangement that had been 3 years in the building would hold the way all his arrangements held. Through Lillian performing correctly, as she always did, as she had been taught to do. He was not worried. He swirled his glass. But there was something about the way Moreau had sounded on the phone. That steadiness. That total absence of the small tells that most men give you when you're managing them. The slight shift in tone when they want something. The warmth that goes mechanical when they're working. Moreau's calls had been perfectly pleasant and completely empty. He gave nothing. He received the conversation and returned nothing of equal value. Randall was accustomed to being the reader in a room. He was not accustomed to finding someone as fluent as he was in the same language. He finished the drink. Lillian was fine. He had invested too much in this to allow otherwise. She knew her function. She would execute it. He poured another drink. Outside the window, Crestfall City ran its nighttime patterns, the shift workers and the night economy and the people who navigated its darker layers. And in a mansion across the city, in a bedroom above a garden he had never seen, a man Randall Hart had badly underestimated was lying awake in the dark with his daughter's file in his memory and a patience in him that Randall Hart had never once encountered in a Mark. But spring was months away, and the dinner invitation was already drafted. And the moment Damien Moreau watched Randall Hart sit across from his daughter for the first time since the wedding, that was when everything would begin. The invitation went out on a Tuesday. Damien handed it to Marcus without explanation. A card, ivory, the Moreau household seal pressed into the upper corner, Randall Hart's name written in the formal script that the house used for guests who were expected to feel honored by the gesture. Dinner. Saturday evening, 7 o'clock. He had written it himself rather than having Helen draft it, which Marcus noticed and said nothing about, because Marcus had been with Damien for 16 years and understood which details mattered. Lillian didn't know about the invitation until Friday afternoon. She found out the way she found out most things in the Moreau household, not through deliberate disclosure, but through the operational machinery of the house running around her, a conversation between Helen and the cook that she caught a piece of while passing through the corridor near the kitchen. Her father's name. Saturday dinner, 7 o'clock. She stopped walking. The corridor was empty, except for her. The kitchen sounds continued on the other side of the wall. Helen's precise instructions, the cook's brief acknowledgments, the ordinary sounds of preparation. Lillian stood with her hand against the wall and focused on breathing. By the time she'd made it back to the library, she had herself arranged again. It was something she'd gotten very good at over the years. The rapid internal reconstruction, pulling all the loose, frightened pieces back into their positions, presenting a surface that didn't show the work underneath. She sat down in her chair. She opened the book she'd been reading. She looked at the same page for 30 minutes without taking in a single word. She heard Damien's car at 6. She heard him come upstairs at 6:15, and she heard the shower, and she heard nothing for a while, and then she heard his footsteps in the hallway, and she set the book down and looked at the door. He knocked. That was something he'd started doing early, knocking on the library door or on the bedroom door when she was inside, rather than simply entering. She hadn't said anything about it. She didn't know how to say anything about it without revealing what it meant to her, which felt dangerous in a way she couldn't fully explain. Doors that knocked were doors you could brace for. Doors that simply opened were something else entirely. "Come in," she said. He came in and found her in the chair, and he looked at her face the way he always did, directly, briefly, gathering information, and then he moved to the opposite chair and sat. "You heard about Saturday," he said. Not a question. "Yes. I should have told you myself." He said it without apology and without the performance of regret. Just a statement of fact, something logged and noted. "That was a mistake." She looked at him. The word mistake said that plainly, from a man who probably made very few of them and was not accustomed to announcing them. Something about it required her full attention. "It's fine," she said. "It isn't," he said. "You should have heard it from me." She didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing. He was watching her with that quality of attention she'd been cataloging for weeks. Not invasive, not aggressive, more like the patience of someone waiting for a mechanism to reveal how it operates. "You don't want him here," he said. Her hands tightened on the book in her lap. She made them stop. "He's my father." "That's not what I asked." The fire had been lit at some point while she was sitting here not reading, one of the staff following the house's seasonal pattern. It made small sounds. Lillian looked at it for a moment and then looked back at Damien. "I don't have opinions about who comes to your house," she said. The sentence was constructed very carefully, each word placed where it could cause the least damage. He let it sit in the air between them for a moment. "You have a lot of opinions," he said. "You just don't use them." She felt heat move into her face. Not anger, or not only anger, something more complicated and less manageable than anger. The specific burn of being seen accurately by someone who has no right to see you that clearly, that fast. "Saturday at 7, she said. "I'll be ready." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once and stood and left the room. She sat in the chair after he was gone and focused on the fire and worked very deliberately on keeping the thing inside her chest from becoming something she couldn't contain. Saturday arrived with the mechanical indifference of all dreaded dates. Lillian dressed with care, not for her father, or not in the way her father would interpret care, the performance of presentation, the correct outfit deployed to produce the correct impression. She dressed deliberately in the sense that each choice was a small act of will. A dark blue dress, the one she'd brought from her father's house that she'd never felt comfortable in, but that Helen had pressed and hung without comment. Low heels, her hair down, the way she never wore it at home because he'd preferred it up. Small things, invisible to anyone who didn't know what they meant. She came downstairs at 10 to 7. Damien was already in the entrance hall. He was in a dark suit, no tie, the top button open, and he was speaking quietly to Marcus, who listened and then moved off toward the back of the house. Damien turned when he heard her on the stairs, and he looked at her the way he did sometimes, that half-second of held attention before the rest of his face settled back into its default neutrality. "You look good," he said. "Thank you." The words came automatically. Then she stopped on the bottom stair because something about the way he'd said it was different from the compliments she was used to. Her father said you look good as an inspection report. Damien said it like he meant the information for her rather than for himself. She filed it away and said nothing and moved into the front sitting room to wait. Randall Hart arrived at 7:02. She heard the car first, then the door, then his voice in the entrance hall. That voice, the public one, the particular frequency of warmth he deployed in new environments where he needed to establish himself. She sat in the sitting room and listened to it and felt the specific physiological response that 20 years of conditioning had built in her, the one she'd never been able to fully dismantle. The narrowing of everything, the heightened peripheral awareness, the calculation of distance. He appeared in the doorway. "There she is," Randall Hart said. He looked the same. Of course he looked the same. She'd been gone 5 weeks, not 5 years. He was still the same composed architecture of a man, the well-fitted suit, the silver at his temples that he wore as authority rather than age, the smile that arrived at precisely the right moment and sat in exactly the right position. He crossed the room and took her hands. "Lillian." He studied her face. Whatever he was looking for, he found enough of it. "You look well. You look—" He glanced around the room at the quality of the furniture and the art and the proportions of the space. Settled. I'm fine, Father. His grip on her hands was light. It had always been light in public. It was one of the things she'd spent years not being able to explain to herself, the way the actual evidence was always so much softer than the reality underneath it. Damien entered the room behind him. Randall turned and extended his hand, and the two men shook, and Lillian watched them from her position near the window with the specific attention of someone trained from childhood to read the air between people who each thought they were the one doing the reading. Damien, Randall said, wonderful house. I haven't been inside before. The grounds alone. Glad you could make it, Damien said. Same tone. Same unhurried steadiness. His eyes had done something when he came in, moved briefly to her, and then to Randall, and then settled into something that was very nearly pleasant, very nearly warm, and entirely unlike anything he actually was. She'd never seen him perform before. It was profoundly unsettling because he was as good at it as her father, which meant the room contained two men fluent in a language designed to conceal. Dinner was served at a table set for three, with the casual elegance of a household that did not need to try. She sat between them at the round table's geography, equidistant, which she hadn't planned but which she recognized immediately as the worst possible position. She would have to divide her attention. She would have to manage both of them simultaneously. She picked up her fork and reminded herself how to eat. The first 20 minutes were her father in a social setting, which meant listening to Randall Hart perform the version of himself that he had spent decades constructing. A story of himself told so smoothly and so often that she suspected he had stopped distinguishing it from reality. He talked about the city's development, about an upcoming civic project, about a charity event he was chairing in the spring. He was charming. He was interesting. He asked Damien intelligent questions and appeared genuinely absorbed by the answers. She watched Damien receive it. He was good. He gave Randall enough answers, small laughs at the right moments, the steady, engaged attention of a host, without giving anything he didn't intend to give. He was harder to read than anyone she'd ever sat across from, which was saying something because she had been reading people for survival since before she could identify it as a skill. And you, darling, Randall said, turning to her with the ease of someone making a natural conversational rotation. You're finding everything comfortable, settling into the routine? Yes, she said. The staff treating you well? Helen, is it? Yes, everyone's been very kind. Good. He nodded with the warmth of someone satisfied by a report. Good. I knew you'd manage. You always manage. She heard the years inside that sentence. You always manage. It sounded in this room like praise. It sounded like confidence in her resilience. It sounded like a father proud of a daughter who adapts. She knew what it meant. It meant, I have never worried about you because you have never been allowed to be a problem. She put a piece of food in her mouth and chewed and made herself swallow. Damien refilled her water glass. The gesture was small. He didn't comment on it or make it a moment. He simply reached over and poured, the way you do for someone sitting next to you, and put the pitcher down. But she caught, in her peripheral vision, the way his eyes moved to her father for exactly 1 second after he did it, and then away. An hour into dinner, Randall reached across and touched her hand. You've barely eaten, he said. His voice was gentle, concerned. The parental register deployed precisely. She looked at her plate. She had eaten less than she realized. I'm not very hungry. You need to eat. His hand was still on hers, and his expression was the soft, worried expression of a man deeply invested in his daughter's well-being. You look thin. Is she eating enough? He redirected to Damien. I worry. She's always done this. Forgets to take care of herself. She felt the temperature of the room change. Or not the room. The man to her left. She eats when she's hungry, Damien said. His voice was still pleasant. The surface was perfectly intact, but she felt it. A degree of something under the pleasantness. The way you feel the cold of a room before the thermometer confirms it. Randall smiled. Of course. Father's habit. You never stop worrying about them. He released her hand and sat back with the relaxed ease of a man making a joke about his own sentimentality. Even when they're grown and married and perfectly taken care of. Naturally, Damien said. The dinner continued. She helped it continue by doing what she'd always done, managing the surface, redirecting when the tension in a conversation reached a level that required intervention, providing the right responses at the right moments. It was the thing she was best at, the skill she had built not by choice, but by necessity, and it still worked. The conversation moved through safe corridors. The food was excellent. The wine was the kind that she suspected cost more than most people's weekly salary. At 9:30, Randall checked his watch, with the gesture of a man who has somewhere important to be. I should let you both have your evening. He rose, and the table rose with him in the way of all social rituals, and she stood, and her father crossed to her and took her by both shoulders and kissed her forehead. It was wonderful to see you. You're doing well, sweetheart. I can see it. She stood inside his hands on her shoulders and looked at the middle of his chest. Goodbye, father. He shook Damien's hand again, thanked him for the dinner, said something about a follow-up call next week to discuss the development project they'd touched on during the meal, and Damien said of course, and then Randall Hart moved through the house toward the door with the smooth momentum of a man who has executed the evening exactly as intended. The front door closed. Lillian stood in the dining room with her hands folded in front of her and waited for the feeling to pass. It always took a few minutes. The residue of his presence, the adrenaline that had spent 2.5 hours with nowhere to go. She heard the car pull away on the gravel. She heard the house settle. She heard Damien come back into the dining room. She didn't turn around right away. She stood at the window and watched the dark of the grounds and breathed. And then she was crying, which was not what she'd planned, which was in fact the last thing she'd planned. But her body had apparently decided that the evening was over and the management phase was done and the bill was now due. She pressed her hand to her mouth. It helped a little. She heard him cross the room. He didn't touch her. He stood near, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to be absent, and was simply there. He does it every time, she said. Her voice was damaged. She hated it. The hand, the "you're not eating," the "I worry." She pressed harder on her mouth and made herself stop for a moment. It's so... She tried for a word and couldn't find one that was large enough. He does it in front of people so you can't react. So any reaction looks like the problem. Damien said nothing. I know what it looks like, she said, from the outside. I know it looks like nothing. He didn't do anything tonight. He touched my hand and said, I was thin. That's all he did. I know, Damien said. It doesn't look like anything. I know what I saw. She turned around then because something in his voice had changed. Or not changed, but surfaced. Something that had been underneath the pleasant dinner host composure all evening, waiting. He was looking at her with those gray eyes that never gave away more than he authorized, but there was something in them right now that was different from the careful patience she'd gotten used to seeing. I need to tell you something, he said. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Old reflex, efficient, unsentimental. Get your face clear and be ready to receive information. Okay, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She understood this about him now, that the pauses weren't hesitation, they were construction. He didn't speak until the words were in the right order. I know what he did to you, he said. Before you came here, I know the specifics. I know the timeline. He paused once more. I've known for several weeks. The room didn't move. The fire didn't change. But something rearranged itself in Lillian's chest with the totality of a structural collapse, everything dropping at once, floor through floor through floor. She stared at him. I should have told you sooner that I knew. His voice was the same, level, careful. The same man who'd said it was a mistake not to tell her about the dinner. The same man who did not perform regret but stated facts. That was also a mistake. How long? She started. Her voice broke. She started again. How? I have resources, he said, which was both an answer and a profound understatement, and she understood that this was as much as he was going to explain about the mechanism. She looked at the floor, the expensive floor of his expensive house where she had spent 5 weeks apologizing for broken glasses and startling at footsteps and taking books from the library like a stray animal testing whether the food would be yanked back. He knew. He had sat across from her at breakfast and been in the library doorway and cleaned the cuts on her fingers and handed her a robe on her wedding night and told her to take the bed. And he had known, for weeks, the whole of it. "Why didn't you say anything?" she said. It wasn't an accusation. She didn't have the architecture for accusation right now. It was a genuine question, driven by the pure bewilderment of someone whose life had not prepared her for this particular experience. "Because you weren't ready," he said. She looked up. "And because you had the right to tell me yourself, if you wanted to." He let that settle. "That was your information, not mine to put in front of you before you were willing to put it there." She couldn't speak. There was a full sentence somewhere behind her sternum, and it was not making it to her mouth. "Your father," Damien said, and the particular flatness that entered his voice when he said those two words was the first time she had heard anything in him that she could call a feeling rather than a management of feelings, "will not have access to you that he has not gone through me to get. Every visit, every call, You can't," she said. He'll what?" She opened her mouth and stopped, because the thing she'd been about to say, the automatic threat assessment she'd been running her entire life, the "he'll be angry, he'll find a way, there's always a consequence," ran directly into the reality of where she was standing, in whose house, beside whom. Damien watched her work through it. He didn't help her or hurry her. "He won't do anything," she said, slowly, like learning a new sentence in an unfamiliar language. "No," Damien said. "He won't." The fire popped. Outside, the security rotation continued its patient circle. The house held them both in its expensive silence. "I don't know what you want from this," she said finally. Her voice was steadier now. Not because she felt steadier, she didn't, but because the steadiness was the only gear she had that still worked. "From telling me. From—" She gestured vaguely at the space between them, at the dinner, at the 5 weeks of mornings and broken glasses and library books. He looked at her for a long moment. "Nothing," he said. The word landed wrong. She frowned. "Everyone wants something." "I know," he said. "I usually do too." He didn't say anything else. He didn't complete the sentence, or explain the exception, or give her a tidy end to attach the moment to. He simply stood in the dining room with the remnants of a dinner he had designed around watching her father operate, and looked at her with the gray eyes and the quiet that she had not yet built a system for. "Get some sleep," he said. He picked up his jacket from the chair back and moved toward the door, and she stood in the empty dining room and felt the ground shift underneath her. Not violently, not the way she was used to ground shifting, not with pain or noise or the specific gravity of consequence. Quietly, like the first movement of something very large that had been still for a very long time. She pressed her palm flat against the dining room table. She needed to think. She needed to... Upstairs in the office she couldn't see from here, a phone rang. She heard it faintly through the house. Then she heard Damien's voice, not the words, just the tone. And then a silence. And then the tone again. And something in the quality of that silence was different from the comfortable silences she'd been cataloging. This silence had edges. She moved to the foot of the stairs without making a decision to move. She heard his voice again, still quiet, controlled. But underneath the control was something that hadn't been there at dinner. Not even when her father had put his hand over hers and said, "You're not eating." Something colder and more operational. Her hand found the banister. The call ended. A moment of complete silence. Then his office door opened and Damien came to the top of the stairs. And when he saw her standing at the bottom, he paused, and something moved across his face that she couldn't name because she'd never seen it before. Not in him, not in anyone. "What happened?" she said. He came down 3 steps. "Your father," he said, "made a phone call tonight, after he left here." His voice was the same level and quiet it always was, but it was carrying something now that changed its weight entirely. "He called 2 people. I have the names. One of them is a man I know from my work, and that man was asked to find out certain things about..." He stopped. The pause was longer than usual. "About you, about what your situation here actually looks like, whether there is something he can use." She stared at him. "He's looking for a way to get leverage," Damien said. "On this marriage, on me, through you." His eyes were very steady on her face. "He is not done, Lillian. He has never been done. He sold you to me because I was the best arrangement available to him, and now he is going to spend the next several years determining what the arrangement is worth and how to extract it. Every part of her that she'd spent the last 5 weeks cautiously thawing went completely still. Of course. Of course he had. She'd been here 5 weeks, sitting in a library reading books and learning that silence could be comfortable, and she had let herself not believe she hadn't let herself believe anything, but she had let herself exist inside the possibility that the arrangement of her life had fundamentally changed, that the distance from her father's house was real distance, that the gate at the end of the driveway meant something. Her father didn't care about distance. Her father cared about access, and he had just demonstrated at a dinner table that he still had it. She looked up at Damien on the stairs. His face was exactly as controlled as it always was, but the cold thing that had surfaced in his voice was in his eyes now too, and she understood with a sudden clarity, the kind that only comes when 2 separate pieces of information lock together and the full shape of a thing reveals itself, that she was not the only person in this house who had a problem with Randall Hart. Damien Moreau had decided something. She could see it in the set of his jaw and the particular stillness of a man who has finished weighing and begun. He was still on the stairs when she found her voice. "What are you going to do?" Damien looked at her for a moment, that long, measured look that she had learned was not absence but the opposite of it, the full weight of his attention gathering before it moved in a direction. "What needs to be done?" he said. It wasn't an answer. She knew it wasn't an answer, but there was something in the way he said it that closed the question the way you close a door. Not slammed, not locked, just firmly shut with the specific intention of not reopening it tonight. He came the rest of the way down the stairs. "Go to bed, Lillian." "Don't," she started. He stopped, waited. "Don't tell me to go to bed like I'm not part of this," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. Something about the revelation had sharpened her, cut through the residue of the dinner and the crying and the vertigo of being seen by someone who had no business seeing her so clearly. "He's my father. Whatever he's doing, whatever you're planning, I'm the one he'll use. I should know." Damien studied her face. Whatever he found there, it shifted something in his expression by a degree that anyone less attuned than she had become would have missed entirely. "In the morning," he said. "Why not now?" "Because tonight you've had enough." He said it without condescension, pure assessment. "And I need to make 2 more calls before I know the full picture." She held his gaze for 3 seconds, which was longer than she had ever held anyone's gaze in her life without dropping it, and then she nodded once and moved past him toward the stairs. She didn't sleep. She lay on her side of the bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house. She heard him in the office below, the low murmur of his voice, brief and calibrated, twice. Then silence. Then his footsteps on the stairs, slow and measured. The door opened. She closed her eyes and held her breath in the practiced way of someone who had spent years performing sleep while remaining completely awake. He moved to his side of the bed without turning on a light. She heard him sit. She heard him pull off his shoes. She heard him lie back with the particular careful stillness of a man trying not to disturb the other person in the room. She opened her eyes in the dark. "Damien." A beat. "Yeah. Did my father plan this from the beginning?" She paused. "The marriage. Did he approach you, or—" "He approached my people," Damien said. 8 months ago. He packaged it as a mutual arrangement, his social infrastructure, his civic connections, a brief pause that contained multitudes, other resources. "And you agreed." "I was interested in the civic piece," he said. "Your father has access to certain permits, certain planning committees. I needed a cleaner line to them." He was quiet for a moment. "The marriage was his condition, not mine." She absorbed this. "So I was the price," she said. "His price," Damien said. "Not mine." She didn't know what that distinction meant yet. She filed it and moved on. "What did he say about me?" "When he proposed it." The silence was longer this time. "He said you were quiet," Damien said, "but obedient. Wouldn't cause problems." Another pause, and in the pause was something that felt like controlled heat, the way the air near a furnace feels even through a closed door. He used the word manageable. Manageable. She let the word sit in her chest where it belonged, alongside all the other words her father had spent 20 years applying to her like labels on inventory. Obedient, quiet, no trouble, good girl. She had been a product in his catalog for so long that he had apparently walked into a room with one of the most dangerous men in the country and described her using the same language he would use for a piece of equipment that had performed to specification. "Okay," she said. "Lillian." "I'm fine," she said. "I just wanted to know." She turned onto her side, away from the center of the bed, and stared at the curtain and the thin line of light that came in at its edge from the grounds below. And she was not fine, but fine was the word she had, and it would hold until morning. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of November sky that settled over everything like a verdict. She was downstairs before him. She made coffee because she had figured out the machine 2 weeks ago, and it was something to do with her hands. And she stood at the kitchen window with a mug and watched the frost on the garden and thought with careful precision about everything she knew. Her father had sold her. She had understood this on some level since the day the arrangement was announced, had felt the shape of it without letting herself name it, the way you can feel an injury through clothing before you're ready to look at it directly. But hearing Damien say manageable in the dark of their bedroom had stripped the last of the abstraction away. She heard him on the stairs at 7:50. He came into the kitchen, registered her at the window, poured his own coffee, and leaned against the counter across from her. He was wearing a plain gray shirt and dark trousers, and he hadn't shaved, and he looked like a man who had slept 3 hours, which she suspected was accurate. "What did your calls tell you?" she said. He wrapped both hands around his mug. "The man your father contacted. His name is Garrett Cole. He runs a private information service, corporate mostly, digging up leverage for business disputes." He paused. "Your father asked him to build a file on this marriage, specifically on whether there are signs of," he used the phrase, "troubled adjustment. He wants evidence that the marriage is under stress." She frowned. "Why?" "Because a troubled marriage gives him access," Damien said. "The concerned father, the mediator, the man who could facilitate an amicable dissolution if the parties agreed." He looked at her directly. "A dissolution that he would structure, that he would control the terms of." She set her coffee down. "He wants me back," she said. Not as a question. As the answer to an equation she'd been running without knowing all the variables. "He wants the asset repositioned," Damien said. "If this marriage fails on his terms, he can renegotiate. Find a better arrangement or use the dissolution as leverage against me. I have interests in 2 of the planning projects he's connected to. A public falling out between our families would cost me more than it would cost him." He paused. He built it as a trap. The marriage was never the goal, the exit was. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the frost on the garden caught what thin light the gray sky offered and held it. "He planned this before the wedding," she said. "Almost certainly." "All of it." Her voice was going somewhere strange, not loud, not broken, just moving in a direction she didn't fully control. "The whole thing." Walking me down the aisle, the hand on my arm, he was already— "Yes," Damien said. She picked up her coffee again because she needed something in her hands. She took a sip she didn't taste and set it back down. "There's more," Damien said. She looked at him. He was watching her with the attention he always gave her and something additional. A caution, she realized. He was being careful. Not managing her, not softening an approach for his own convenience. Being genuinely careful about what the next piece of information would do. "Tell me," she said. "Cole's file isn't the primary problem," Damien said. "Cole is a minor operation. His people have been on the grounds twice in the last week. I know, because my security flagged vehicles running the perimeter road. That's manageable." He paused again. "What isn't manageable is what I found when I pulled the original background on your father's finances." She waited. "He's overextended," Damien said. "Significantly. 3 development projects in default, 2 more leveraged against assets that don't fully exist. He has been running a financial structure that depends entirely on the appearance of solvency while operating at a loss across most of his portfolio." He set his mug down. "The civic connections, the planning committees, the permits, those aren't favors he can offer freely. They're the last liquid assets he has. He doesn't give me access to them. He trades them for financial cover, for my name behind his, She understood now, the full shape of it. I'm not the asset, she said slowly. I'm the proof of concept. If this marriage holds, if your name is attached to his family, people assume he's stable. They assume there's backing behind him. Yes. And if the marriage fails on his terms, he restructures and tries again with someone else. But if it fails in a way he doesn't control, he loses everything, Damien said. The civic position, the portfolio, the public image. He picked up his mug again. Which is why he is moving faster than I anticipated. He needs this resolved in his favor before his financial structure becomes visible to the people holding his debts. She sat down at the kitchen table. She sat with her hands flat on the surface and the gray light coming through the window and the mug of cooling coffee in front of her. And she thought about the man who had walked her down the aisle and kissed her forehead last night and told her she looked well, who had used the word manageable to describe his own daughter to a criminal syndicate head who had been bankrupt in every way that mattered while performing the role of a man at the height of his standing. She had known he was cruel. She had not known he was desperate. Desperate was different. Desperate was more dangerous. Desperate was a man with no remaining patience for his own performance. He's going to come here again, she said. Yes, soon. Probably this week, Damien said. Cole's people were here twice in 7 days. He'll want a direct read before he makes his next move. She looked at Damien across the table. What do you want me to do? She said. He looked at her for a long moment. Nothing different than what you've been doing. That's not an answer. It is, he said. You don't have to perform anything. You don't have to manage anything for his benefit. He paused. When he comes, I need you to let me watch. Just let me watch and don't cover for him. She frowned. What do you mean? You smooth things over, he said. It wasn't criticism. She heard the absence of criticism, which made it land differently than judgment would have. When the air in a room goes wrong, you fix it, you redirect, you absorb, you make yourself the bridge between whatever tension is present and wherever it needs to go. He looked at her steadily. When he comes, I need you not to do that. Whatever is real, let it be real. She stared at him. She understood what he was asking. She also understood that what he was asking was, for her, the equivalent of asking someone who had learned to swim in rough water to stop moving their arms. The management of surface tension was not a choice she made. It was a reflex built so deep into her system that she often didn't know she was doing it until it was done. I'll try, she said. He nodded. He didn't push for more than that. Randall called that same afternoon. She was in the library when Helen brought her the phone, and she looked at her father's name on the screen and took one breath and answered. Sweetheart? He was warm, easy. The morning after voice, the follow-up call that was designed to feel like natural concern. I just wanted to check in. Last night was wonderful. Damien is an impressive man. You seem happy. I'm fine, she said. You are. He said it like confirmation. I could see it. I wasn't sure in the beginning. I'll be honest with you, I worried. A new environment, a new dynamic. But you looked settled, comfortable. That's all I ever wanted for you. She pressed her free hand flat against her thigh. I have to ask, he continued, and here it was, the mild parental tone sliding half a degree towards something with a little more purchase. Is everything working between you and Damien? I only ask because you seemed a little quiet at dinner, a little inside yourself. I was tired, she said. Of course. A brief pause. He treats you well? You can tell me, sweetheart, whatever it is. If there's anything, He treats me well, she said. Another pause. Longer. Good. Back to warm. Back to easy. That's what I needed to hear. I was thinking of stopping by later this week. Wednesday, maybe. Just briefly. I found something of yours that was left behind. Some photographs, a few things from your room. I thought you'd want them. She knew there were no photographs. There had never been photographs in her room worth retrieving. She had exactly one picture of her mother, and it was in her bag and it had come with her. Wednesday is fine, she said. I'll let Helen know. Perfect. His voice settled into satisfaction. I'll see you then. She hung up. She sat in the library chair with the phone in her lap and her hand still flat against her thigh, and she was not smoothing anything over right now. There was no one to smooth it for, and so she let herself feel the full unmanaged weight of that conversation. The systematic falseness of it, the precision of his probes, the way he had used the word worried like a man genuinely capable of worry. She felt sick. She went and told Damien about the call. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Wednesday," he said. "He said he had things to bring me. There's nothing to bring. It's a cover." "I know." He was already thinking past the conversation. She could see it, the gaze going inward, the same way it did when he was on a call and processing two things at once. "Wednesday is good. What are you going to do?" "Let him come," Damien said. "Let him run whatever read he came to run." He looked at her then. "And then let him see what he actually built." She didn't know what that meant. She found out Wednesday at 2:17 in the afternoon, when Randall Hart walked into the front sitting room with a small bag of items she had never owned and a smile that didn't reach anything above his cheekbones, and looked at his daughter, and something in what he saw there made the smile recalibrate by a fraction of a degree. Because she had tried, this time, not to fix her face before he arrived. She had sat in the sitting room for 30 minutes before his car came up the drive, and she had worked very deliberately on dismantling the performance, on releasing the practiced neutral expression, on letting her hands sit in her lap without folding them into the correct arrangement, on leaving her face alone. It was harder than anything she had done in recent memory. The reflexes fired constantly, and she kept overriding them one by one, like cutting wires. When Randall walked in, what he saw was his daughter sitting in a chair looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face in 20 years. Not hostile, not angry, not broken, just present. He faltered. Half a step. Recovered. "Lillian." He crossed the room and leaned in to kiss her cheek, and she didn't orient her face toward it, and he caught her cheek instead of landing the kiss cleanly. And it was a small thing, a barely there disruption, but she felt him register it. "Father," she said. He sat across from her and set the bag down and looked at her with the warm, attentive expression. "You look rested," he said. "I slept well." "Good." He opened the bag and began taking things out. A scarf she didn't recognize, a small picture frame with a generic print in it, a book she had never read. Building his story with props. "I thought you might want these. I know how attached you are to your things." She watched his hands on the props. She said nothing. The silence lasted 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than her father was accustomed to her allowing before she filled it. He looked up. "Is everything all right?" he said. "Yes." "You seem—" He assessed her with the precision of a man who had spent 20 years reading her and was encountering something that wasn't parsing correctly, different. "Do I?" Not a question. She heard the flatness in her own voice with a distant surprise. She hadn't planned that tone. It had simply arrived, which meant it was true rather than performed. Randall set the book down. The warmth in his expression was still there, but it was working harder now. She could see it working. She had never been able to see it working before. Or perhaps she had seen it and had not let herself trust what she was seeing, because trusting your own perception in that house had always been a fast route to consequences. "Talk to me," he said. "Whatever it is. You can always talk to me." "I know," she said. "Damien hasn't... He's been very good to me." A pause. "Good." The word came out a half-beat slower than it should have. "That's what I want. That's all I've ever..." "I know what you want," she said. The room went very still. She hadn't planned that sentence either. It arrived the same way the flat tone had. Not performed, not constructed, simply true, moving from somewhere deep and long compressed toward the surface without asking her permission. Randall looked at her. She looked back at him. And in the space of that eye contact, she saw it, just for a second, just in the small shift of his jaw and the tightening around his eyes, the thing he kept behind the warmth. She had seen it before. Fragments of it over 20 years, always at moments when she had inadvertently failed to perform correctly. The piece of him that was not a father and had never been a father, the piece that calculated and assessed and had decided when she was very small that she was most useful as a surface for his narrative. Then the door opened. Damien walked in. He was unhurried. He was wearing exactly what he'd been wearing that morning, which communicated without words that this visit was not an occasion he had dressed for. He crossed to where she was sitting and stood beside her chair, not in front of her, not between her and her father, but beside her in the particular geometry of someone standing with someone rather than over them. "Randall," he said, "didn't realize you were already here." Just stop by, Randall said. The warm smile returned, directed upward. Dropping off a few things. I was just about to… Stay, Damien said. Have something. It wasn't an invitation. It was the particular construction of a sentence that sounded like an invitation and functioned as a directive, and Randall Hart, who was fluent enough in power to recognize the difference, went very slightly still. I shouldn't impose, he said. You're not imposing. Damien moved to the opposite chair and sat. Lillian tells me you've been attentive since the wedding, checking in, making sure she's comfortable. Of course, Randall said. She's my daughter. Damien's expression was pleasant, completely pleasant. Garrett Cole sends his regards, by the way. The color in Randall Hart's face did something. It didn't drain. That would have been too dramatic, too visible, too much evidence for a man of his practiced self-control. It simply shifted, the way a room shifts when a cloud moves over the sun. Barely perceptible if you weren't watching for it. She was watching for it. I'm sorry, Randall said. Garrett Cole, Damien said. Information service, primarily corporate. You contracted him about 3 weeks ago. He said it the way you state a fact you have no particular investment in. An address, a number, a piece of data. He's been running a file on my household, which I found inconvenient. Randall opened his mouth. I've spoken to him, Damien said. He was very cooperative. People usually are. A pause the length of a held breath. He gave me the full scope. What you asked for, what you were building toward, what you intended to do with the results. That's… Randall stopped, started again. I don't know what he told you, but whatever he said everything, Damien said, including the financial picture, the portfolio, the defaults. He tilted his head by a fraction. The reason you needed this marriage to either hold in a visible way or fail in a way you controlled. Randall Hart sat across from the most dangerous man in the city and did something she had never seen him do. He went quiet. Not the calculated quiet he sometimes deployed in negotiations, the strategic silence, the power pause. This was different. This was the quiet of a man who has walked into a room expecting to run the board and found someone already sitting at the head of the table who had been there longer and knew the room better. Lillian sat between them and breathed and did not fix her face and did not redirect and did not perform. Lillian, her father said. He turned to her and the warmth came back. A different register of it now. Targeted. The weapon version rather than the ambient version. Whatever you think you've heard, she hasn't heard anything she didn't already know, Damien said. Randall's eyes moved back to him. The question, Damien said, his voice still entirely level, is what happens next. I don't see why this needs to be… Your organization is carrying $4.7 million in debt that becomes callable in March, Damien said. You have 2 projects in active default and 1 permit approval that was issued based on documentation I'm told was adjusted before submission. The pleasant expression had not changed. It did not need to change. It was doing its job simply by remaining in place while the words under it did something entirely different. That last piece alone is a significant exposure. The room had a quality that she recognized from very different circumstances. The quality of air before impact. The particular charge that accumulates between a thing that is about to happen and the moment before it happens. Her father looked at her again. Sweetheart, he said. His voice had dropped to something almost private, almost tender. The most accurate weapon in his arsenal, the one he had used for 20 years because it worked. Talk to him. Whatever you… We're family. You don't let family… She is not your leverage, Damien said. 3 words. Not loud. Not performative, just final. Randall's breath went in and didn't come back out at the right speed. She could hear it. She had always been able to hear the specific sound of him recalibrating, had cataloged it across 20 years without knowing that's what she was doing, had learned to brace for what came after it. You have no idea, Randall said, and the warmth was gone entirely now. And what was underneath it was something she knew and had always known, the real register, the one that lived behind all the others. What you've inserted yourself into. This is a family matter. This is between me and my… Your daughter, Damien said, has not been safe with you since she was old enough to be afraid of you. The silence that followed was absolute. Randall Hart's face did something she had never seen it do. Not the color change, not the jaw tighten. Something deeper. Something that looked, for one unguarded second, like the face of a man who has been named accurately in public for the first time in his life and does not know what to do with the exposure. Then it closed. Locked back down. Reorganized. The architecture rebuilt in real time, the smile returning in a diminished form, the eyes finding their practiced arrangement. "This conversation," he said quietly, "is not over." He stood. He picked up the bag, the props, the scarf she didn't own, the picture frame, the book, and he crossed the room, and he passed Lillian's chair, and she looked straight ahead, and she did not move, and she did not manage anything, and he walked out. She heard his footsteps in the hall. She heard the front door. She heard the car. She heard it leave. Then she heard the house again, its ordinary sounds, the staff moving somewhere distant, the property settling around its silence, and she sat in the chair with her hands loose in her lap, and her face still exactly where she'd left it, unmanaged, unperformed, just her. And she felt something move through her chest that she couldn't name precisely, but that she understood was the feeling of a door closing, not trapping her, closing behind her. She had walked through it. "Lillian," Damien's voice, quiet. She turned her head and looked at him. He was watching her with the gray eyes and the attention that never asked her to be something she wasn't. "He'll come back," she said. "I know. He won't stop because you named it." "No," Damien said. "He won't stop." He paused. "But what he does next will be from a position I've prepared for, not one he's designed." He looked at her steadily. "And you won't face it the way you've faced everything before." She searched his face. "How will I face it?" she said. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his eyes level with hers across the room. "From here," he said. She understood he meant the house, the grounds, the gate, the infrastructure of a life that was, for the first time, oriented toward protecting her rather than containing her. She looked down at her hands in her lap, the hands that had not folded themselves, that had not performed anything today, that had simply been her hands. Her phone buzzed on the side table. She picked it up. The number was one she didn't recognize, but the text was 3 words and a name she knew. And the 3 words turned everything that had just happened from an ending into a... The text was 3 words and a name. He filed it. The name below it was a lawyer she didn't recognize, Aldous Verne, with a firm address in the financial district. And below the name was a case number and a court designation and a filing timestamp that read 11:47 a.m., which was 43 minutes before her father had walked into this room with his bag of props and his recalibrated smile. He had filed before he came. Whatever this was, he had already set it in motion before he sat across from her and called her sweetheart. She turned the phone toward Damien. He read it. His face did nothing visible, but he stood up from the chair in a single motion that had no leisure in it and crossed to the door and said, "Marcus," before he was fully through it. And Marcus materialized from somewhere in the hall with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting to be needed. She followed. She didn't ask permission, and he didn't tell her to stay, which she registered as its own kind of information. In the office, Damien was already on his phone. She stood near the door and listened to half a conversation, clipped, precise, the language of someone directing rather than requesting, while Marcus stood at the desk and pulled something up on the laptop with the focused speed of a man navigating familiar territory under pressure. "What is it?" she said. Not a question directed at either of them specifically, just the need to know, put into the air. Marcus glanced at Damien. Damien caught the glance from across the room without appearing to look up from his own call and gave something back, a small motion, chin barely dropping. And Marcus turned the laptop toward her. It was a legal filing, civil action. The language was dense and formal, and she had not spent time around lawyers, but she had spent time around a man who deployed instruments of control with precision, and she understood the shape of this even through the formal scaffolding. Randall Hart was filing for conservatorship, not of his finances, of her. The filing claimed, with documentation she could see had been assembled over weeks, that his daughter had entered a marriage under conditions of psychological duress, that she showed evidence of significant trauma response and impaired decision-making capacity, that the marriage arrangement had been facilitated by a third party with a known history of coercive organizational practices, and that Lillian Hart Moreau required a legal guardian to represent her interests until the matter could be adjudicated. Legal guardian. Her father. She set the laptop back on the desk very carefully. Her hands were steady. She noticed this with a distant, almost clinical interest. The hands were steady, the breathing was wrong, shallow and quick in the upper chest, but the hands were steady, which meant some part of her had already moved past shock into whatever comes after. Damien finished the call. He built the file before the wedding, he said. He was looking at her. He had the filing ready before tonight's dinner, possibly before the wedding itself. The Cole operation wasn't gathering information to build leverage. It was gathering evidence to support a filing he had already drafted. She heard herself say, "He planned to do this from the beginning." Yes. He wanted the marriage to happen so he could challenge it. The filing positions him as the aggrieved party who placed his daughter in an arrangement he now believes was harmful, Damien said. It gives him standing. It gives him the narrative of a concerned father fighting a powerful man for his child's welfare. The flatness in his voice was the temperature of something very cold. Which plays significantly better than the alternative narrative. Which is that he sold me, she said. Which is that he sold you. She sat down in the chair across from his desk because her legs had reached a decision without consulting the rest of her. She sat with her hands flat on her thighs and looked at the filing on the laptop screen and thought about timing. He had been in this room 90 minutes ago. He had called her sweetheart. He had touched her cheek when she didn't orient her face toward his kiss, and he had felt the change in her, and he had looked at her with the face she had finally let herself see underneath the warmth. And then he had walked out of this house knowing the filing was already in the system, knowing that every word in that room, every dynamic she had let show, every unmanaged moment she had allowed herself, he had already accounted for, already folded into the narrative. She had thought she was finally refusing to perform. He had been watching her refuse and filing it as evidence. He knew, she said, when I didn't fix my face, when I didn't smooth it over, he was watching me not perform and counting it as proof that something was wrong with me. Damien's jaw had the set it got when he had arrived at a decision and was running the implementation. Yes. So everything I did right today made his case look stronger, Damien said, to someone who hadn't seen the context, to a judge reading a cold filing. He came around the desk and crouched in front of her chair, at her level, the way he'd crouched on the kitchen floor the day she'd broken the glass, and looked at her directly. This does not mean you did anything wrong. You did not do anything wrong. She looked at him. This is what he does, Damien said. He builds rooms where every exit looks like a mistake. You could have performed all the way through today and he would have used it differently. The compliant daughter, the controlled responses, proof of a woman conditioned not to speak. His eyes were very steady. There was no version of today that he hadn't already tried to use. She breathed. Okay, she said. I need you to stay in this house tonight, he said. I need you not to take any calls from him or from numbers you don't recognize. Do you understand? Yes. If anyone comes to the door, I understand, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he stood, and the phone in his hand was already going to his ear before he'd fully straightened. The next 3 hours moved in the specific way of hours spent waiting in a situation too large to act on directly. Long and pressurized, each minute with more weight than it should carry. She stayed in the library because the library was where she went when she needed something to hold on to, and she sat in her chair and did not read and listen to the house. Damien was in the office. She could hear intermittent conversation, footsteps, once the sound of the front door opening and closing as someone arrived or left. Marcus passed the library doorway twice without looking in, the second time speaking quietly into his own phone. At 9 p.m., she went to the kitchen and made tea because she needed to do something with her hands. Helen found her there and said nothing about the tea and put a plate of food on the counter near her without commenting on whether or not she would eat it. She ate half of it standing up, looking at the dark window above the sink. At 9:47, the front door opened hard. Not slammed, but opened with the kind of speed that communicates the status of the person opening it, and she heard Damien's voice and another voice, not Marcus, and then the office door, and then nothing. She put her mug down and went into the hallway. Marcus was outside the office door. What happened? She said. He looked at her. Marcus had a face built for withholding information, but she had been in this house for 6 weeks, and she had been reading people her entire life. and she caught something in the set of his eyes that moved her toward the door before she'd decided to move. "Mrs. Moreau." She opened the office door. Two men she didn't know were inside, both standing. Damien was behind the desk, and he looked up when she came in, and his face was doing the thing it only did when the situation had escalated past the level he had planned for. Not panic. Damien Moreau didn't have panic in his available register, but a kind of compressed intensity that changed the quality of the air around him. "Out," he said to the two men. To her he said nothing, which meant stay. The two men filed past her into the hallway. She heard Marcus follow them. The door closed. "He moved up the timeline," Damien said. "How?" "The conservatorship filing isn't the primary instrument." He came around the desk. "It's the distraction. While I've been on the phone with my legal team about the filing, he's been making a different set of calls." He stopped in front of her. "There are two members of the City Planning Commission who have been presented with a very specific piece of information tonight. About my organization. About a transaction from 8 years ago that has been recontextualized." She waited. "If the commission acts on it, 3 of my infrastructure permits get suspended pending review," he said, "which triggers a clause in 2 of my financing arrangements that makes them callable on demand." He looked at her steadily. "Which costs me significantly. More than the permits themselves, the calling of those arrangements at the same time as a legal action against this marriage creates a public picture that is very hard to operate through." "He's hitting everything at once," she said. "Yes. Can you hold it?" "I can hold most of it." He paused on that word. Well, most, with the specific weight of a man who does not use qualifiers casually. "The commission is the problem. I have relationships there, but the information he's presented is old enough and real enough that the 2 members who received it are going to feel obligated to act on it regardless of the relationship. The optics of not acting are worse for them than acting." She absorbed this. "What was the transaction?" she said. He looked at her. 8 years ago," she said. "What was it?" A moment. "A financial arrangement with a construction firm that was later found to have connections to a competing organization," he said. "I didn't know at the time. By the time I knew, the project was complete and the connection was historical. I've operated cleanly from it since." He paused. "It was documented. Your father found the documentation." "How?" "Because your father has been inside 3 of the City Planning Commission's archived files for the last 6 months, Damien said, and there was something underneath the level voice now, something that had been there since she walked in, something grinding and pressurized. "He got access through the civic committee positions. He has been building this specific instrument since before he approached me." The cold moved through her all the way to her sternum. "He didn't just plan the marriage," she said. "He planned what came after the marriage failed." "He built the entire sequence," Damien said. "The approach, the arrangement, the filing, the commission action. All of it staged to run on a timeline he controlled." He stopped. "I underestimated the depth of the preparation." She had never heard him say that before. She absorbed it with the gravity it deserved. "What do we do?" she said. "I need to be in front of the commission members before morning," he said. "In person. There are things that can be said in person that can't be said through intermediaries." He was already moving, reaching for his jacket. "Marcus will be here. Helen will be here. You don't open the door for anyone." "Damien." He stopped. "What aren't you telling me?" she said. He looked at her across the office. The lamp on the desk threw its light across one side of his face and left the other in shadow. And he looked for the first time since she'd known him like a man carrying the full weight of his particular life. "Your father filed a secondary document with the conservatorship petition," he said. "An affidavit, signed by a physician." Her throat tightened. "He claims to have medical documentation of your psychological state," Damien said, "dating back 3 years, framing the same history that is his crime as evidence of your instability." He said it with a flatness that she recognized was the maximum containment of something that was not flat at all. "He is using what he did to you as the instrument to control you." She stood in the office and felt the specific sensation of a floor dropping, not the panicked drop, not the free fall, but the slow, terrible drop of understanding arriving in full. Her scars, her history, her trauma responses, the startle reflex and the apologies and the way she held herself small in rooms. Every piece of evidence that his house had built in her body, that Damien had seen on their wedding night and understood for what it was. Her father had found a doctor to describe it differently, not as the evidence of damage done by him, as the evidence of damage that was simply her, inherent, pre-existing, a condition requiring management, his management. He's going to court with it, she said. Next Thursday, Damien said. Emergency petition. His lawyer filed for an expedited hearing on the basis of, he used the phrase ongoing harm. His voice was very controlled. Meaning this house. Meaning me. She pressed her hand against the desk. If the petition goes through, she said, slowly, building the sentence from its worst parts. If a judge grants the conservatorship, you would be legally required to leave this house, Damien said, pending the outcome of the full hearing, which his legal team will extend as long as possible. He stopped. And during that period, your father would have legal authority over your medical decisions, your financial decisions, and your residence. She heard it all the way down, all the way to the bottom of 20 years. She had left his house. She had come here. She had spent 6 weeks learning that silence could be comfortable and doors could knock before they opened, and a man who ruled through fear could hand her a robe and tell her to take the bed and clean cuts on her fingers with more care than anyone had ever used on her. And her father had spent those same 6 weeks building the legal architecture to put her back. Go, she said. Damien looked at her. Go to the commission members, she said. Do what you need to do. She took her hand off the desk and straightened. I'm not going anywhere. Something moved across his face. Lillian. I said go, she said. Not loud, not broken. The voice that had arrived earlier tonight when she'd told her father she knew what he wanted. That voice, the one that came from somewhere she hadn't known existed until recently. The place that had survived 20 years and was apparently done being quiet about it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, and he moved past her, and she heard him in the hallway, and she heard the front door, and she heard the car. She stood in the office alone. She moved to the desk and sat in his chair and pulled the laptop toward her and opened the filing. She read it from the beginning. All of it. Every crafted paragraph. Every reframed piece of her own history. Every clinical-sounding description of a young woman whose responses to the world suggested impaired functioning. Each one of which was accurate, and each one of which meant something entirely different from what the filing claimed it meant. She read the physician's affidavit, which had the specific texture of a document where the facts were real and the conclusions were fabricated, the worst kind of lie because it was wearing her own life as its disguise. She read until midnight, then she picked up her phone. She did not call Damien. He was doing what he needed to do. She called the number that had sent her the text, the unknown number, the lawyer's number, Aldous Verne, and it rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and she left a message in the steady voice that was apparently what she sounded like when she had nothing left to perform. This is Lillian Hart Moreau. I've read the filing. I need to meet with you before Thursday. There are things in that affidavit that I can speak to directly, and I will. She paused. Call me back. She hung up. She set the phone on the desk and looked at the office. The bookshelves, the lamp, the organized surface of a desk that belonged to a man who had looked at the evidence of everything her father had done and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with something he hadn't named out loud yet. She thought about the gala. Damien had mentioned it 3 weeks ago. A gathering, one of the major annual events that the city's significant figures attended. A room full of power and its attendants. It was in 12 days. She had been planning to wear something appropriate, to stand beside him and be quiet and manageable. She thought about a black dress. She thought about a back that wasn't covered. She was still thinking about it when her phone rang. Not Verna, not Damien, not a number she knew. She looked at the screen for 2 seconds. She answered, Lillian. Her father's voice was different. The warmth was gone entirely, which was almost a relief. She had spent so many years waiting for the warmth to drop that its actual absence felt like honesty. I know what you're doing. I know he's trying to manage this, but I want you to understand something. A pause. I have more than the affidavit. I have the original emergency room reports. I have the social worker's flag from when you were 17. His voice went quieter. I buried those. I can unbury them in a way that is very bad for you, or I can unbury them in a way that ends this cleanly. Your choice. She held the phone. Those reports, she said, are going to come out either way. Silence. The only question, she said, is whose version of them the judge hears first. She heard her father breathe. You should come home, he said. Very quiet now. The quietest she had ever heard him. Tomorrow. Just come. I am home, she said. She hung up. She set the phone face down on the desk. Outside the office window, the Moreau grounds lay in their nighttime arrangement. The security lights, the frost on the grass, the gate at the end of the drive that she had come through 6 weeks ago in the back of a black car, with her hands cold and her heart running too fast, and her entire operational intelligence focused on getting through whatever came next. She looked at the window for a long time. Then she opened the laptop again and started writing. Not a legal document, not a response to the filing. Something else. Something that had been assembling itself in the back of her mind since she'd read the affidavit, since she'd heard her own history described in her father's language, since she'd understood that the instrument he was using was the truth of what had happened to her, reframed. If the truth was the instrument, then she needed to hold the... She wrote until 2 a.m, not a legal document, not a rebuttal formatted for a court clerk's intake system. A statement, her own words, in her own order, beginning at the beginning and moving through every year with the specific precision of someone who had spent 2 decades memorizing details because details were the only evidence she'd ever had, that her own experience was real. She wrote about being 7 years old and learning which floorboards in the hallway were the ones that didn't creak. She wrote about the emergency room at age 9, the nurse who had looked at her arm too long before looking away, and the specific quality of the looking away, and how she had understood even then what that quality meant. That the woman had seen something and decided, for reasons Lillian couldn't access, that she would not pursue what she had seen. She wrote about the social worker at 17. She wrote her name. She wrote the date of the visit, the specific questions she'd been asked in the room with her father present, the answers she had given, and then the answers she would have given if she had been alone. She wrote the difference between those 2 sets of answers in plain language that required no interpretation. She wrote about the scars. Not medically, not clinically. She wrote about where each one came from, in what year, in what room of that house, under what stated justification. Because there had always been a stated justification, her father had never once done anything without a framework of reason that positioned him as the corrective and her as the variable requiring correction. She wrote the justifications the way she'd heard them, in his words, and then she wrote what was underneath the words, and the gap between the two was the entire case. When she finished, she read it once. Then she sent it to Aldous Vern's email address, which she found on the legal firm's website, with a single line above it. This is my account. Unedited. I will sign it. She closed the laptop. She sat in Damien's chair in the quiet of the office and listened to the house and felt something she could not immediately name. Not peace, not triumph, not the relief she might have expected from having finally put the full truth of her life into words and sent it somewhere. Something closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you've been carrying so long you'd stopped registering it as heavy. The absence of the weight, rather than the presence of anything replacing it. Her back hurt. She hadn't noticed until now. She'd been sitting at the desk for hours in the wrong posture, her spine curved forward over the keyboard, and the old scars across her back were doing what they did sometimes in cold weather or sustained tension. A deep, diffuse ache that wasn't sharp enough to be acute pain but was present enough to be impossible to ignore. She stood and stretched very carefully and went upstairs and got into bed and lay in the dark and was asleep before she registered having closed her eyes. Damien came back at 4:15. She heard the car, heard the door, heard him on the stairs, and she was awake by the time he reached the landing, not from fear, but from the same calibrated awareness she'd been living in for the past 12 hours. She lay still and listened to him move through the room. He sat on his side of the bed. For a long moment he didn't lie down. He sat at the edge, and she could hear his breath in the dark. Not labored, not distressed, but carrying the particular quality of controlled exhaustion, the breath of someone who has run a very long race and has now stopped moving for the first time. "Did it work?" she said quietly. A pause. "Partially," he said. She waited. "One of the commission members agreed to delay the action pending a review of the original documentation," he said. "The second one wouldn't move. He's going forward with the suspension of 2 of the permits. He was quiet for a moment. The financing arrangements can absorb 1 suspension, not 2. What does that mean? It means the next 3 months will be expensive, he said, and complicated. Another pause. It means your father succeeded in doing damage. She lay in the dark and absorbed this. I wrote a statement, she said. She felt him turn his head in the dark. Everything, she said. Dates, rooms, specifics, the ER visits, the social worker, the scars, where each one came from. She kept her voice level. I sent it to Vern, the lawyer whose number texted me. I told him I'd sign it. Silence. Lillian, he's using my history as the instrument, she said. The only way to take the instrument back is to hold it myself. She paused. I should have been the one holding it all along. He was quiet for a long time. That document goes into a court filing. It becomes public record, he said. I know. Everyone will see it. I know, she said. I know what that means. She looked at the ceiling in the dark. I've been hiding it my entire life, and it kept me exactly where he wanted me. Hidden things are easier to reframe. She paused. I'm done letting him frame it. The dark held them both. Okay, Damien said. Just that. Not a management of her decision, not a strategic overlay, not a reframing of her choice in terms of what was optimal. Just, okay. Her decision received and respected at face value. She felt his weight shift as he lay back. They lay in the dark, and neither of them spoke again. And somewhere toward 5 in the morning, she heard his breathing change into the slower rhythm of sleep, and she lay beside him in the quiet of the house and thought, this is what it feels like when someone doesn't need you to be anything other than what you are. She thought about that for a long time. Then she slept again. The hearing was on a Thursday. The 11 days between Randall's filing and the court date moved with the exhausting density of time spent in sustained crisis. Each day longer than the last, each piece of incoming information requiring a response, a calibration, a decision. Damien's legal team worked in parallel with Vern, who had called her back the morning after she sent the statement and said, in the dry, precise voice of a man who dealt in documentation for a living, that what she had sent him was the most comprehensive first-person account he had received in 22 years of practice. Will it work? She'd asked. There are no guarantees in an expedited hearing, he said, but your father's affidavit relies on a physician's interpretation of behavioral patterns. Your statement provides the source of those patterns with specific, verifiable, date-stamped detail. A pause. The question is whether you can say it in that room the way you wrote it here. I can, she said, without breaking. I might break, she said. I'll say it anyway. Verna was quiet for a moment, then, Thursday, 9 a.m. I'll meet you outside. The gala was on a Wednesday. She had not forgotten about it. She had in fact thought about it with increasing specificity as the days moved toward it. The black dress she had pulled from the closet 4 days after the filing, hung it on the back of the bathroom door, and looked at it each morning while she brushed her teeth, thinking about the cut of it, thinking about what it covered and what it didn't. On Wednesday afternoon, she stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bedroom. The dress was black, floor-length, with a neckline that was modest and a back that was not. The back was open from the base of her neck to her lower spine, a design that she had owned for a year and never worn because there had never been anywhere she could wear it and nowhere she would have wanted to. She put it on. She looked at herself in the mirror. The scars crossed her back in their familiar pattern. Some faded to silver, some still holding a pink-brown that never fully whitened, the particular topography of a history that her skin had been keeping for her when nothing else could. She knew them by feel better than by sight. She had spent years not looking. She looked now. They were ugly in the way that evidence is ugly, not aesthetically, not inherently, but because of what they meant, because of the story they told, because no amount of time made the story less true. They were also hers, every single one of them. He had put them there, but he did not own them. He had never owned them. He had spent 20 years trying to make her feel that he did, that her body and its history were his property, his to manage, his to keep quiet. And she had spent 20 years believing him, and she was done. She did her hair. She put on the small diamond earrings that had appeared in her jewelry box 2 weeks after the wedding with no note. which she had come to understand was simply how Damien operated when he wanted to give something without making it a moment. She went downstairs. He was in the entrance hall in a black suit, talking to Marcus, and he turned when he heard her on the stairs, and the rest of his sentence stopped mid-word. He looked at her. She came down the last few stairs and stood at the bottom and let him look, because this was not something she needed to explain or manage or provide context for. This was simply her, in a dress, walking down the stairs of a house she lived in. He crossed to her. He didn't say anything about the dress, or the back, or the scars. He looked at her face with the gray eyes that had never asked her to be smaller than she was, and he offered her his arm. She took it. The gala was held in a ballroom in the city's oldest hotel, the kind of room that had been designed in an era when rooms were built to make people feel the appropriate scale of their own insignificance, with ceilings that required the eye to travel to reach them and light that came from arrangements of crystal that turned everything golden and soft. It was full of people who mattered in the ways that this city assigned mattering: political weight, financial weight, the social weight of names that opened doors. She walked in on Damien Moreau's arm, and she was aware in her peripheral vision of the way the room received them. Not dramatically. There was no gasp, no moment. People didn't stop mid-sentence, but there was a redistribution of attention, heads that turned, gazes that caught and held, the social recalibration of a room that was processing something it hadn't expected to process. She had spent her life trying to take up less space in rooms. She walked through the center of this one. She kept her shoulders back and her chin level, and she moved at her own pace, not the managed pace of someone trying to get through quickly, and she felt the air of the room move around her, and she did not flinch from it. A woman approached, 50s, silver-haired, the kind of composed that only comes from decades of being in rooms like this, and extended her hand and said, "Lillian, I've been meaning to introduce myself, Constance Adler. I sit on the Arts Foundation board." Lillian shook her hand. "I know who you are," Lillian said, not aggressively, just directly. "It's nice to meet you." Constance Adler looked at her for a moment with an expression that recalibrated in real time. Then she smiled. A different smile than the initial social one, something with more substance behind it. "Well, it's nice to meet you too." The evening moved. She talked to people. She discovered that she could do this, that the skills she'd spent 20 years developing under a specific kind of duress could function in different contexts, that the ability to read a room and understand what it needed was not inherently a survival mechanism, it was just intelligence applied to social geography, and she had it. The difference was that tonight she was choosing to use it, not because she had to, because she wanted to. Halfway through the evening, she excused herself from a conversation and stood near the edge of the room for a moment, alone, and let herself breathe. She looked out across the ballroom, all of it, the people, and the light, and the golden hum of 100 conversations happening simultaneously. And she thought about Thursday, about the courtroom, about the statement she would deliver in her own voice, in her own words, in front of a judge who would hear the two versions of her history and have to determine which one was true. She was not afraid. She was many things, tired, tight in the chest, fully aware of how much was riding on what happened in that room. But she was not afraid. Fear was the thing her father had always relied on. Fear was his primary instrument, had been his primary instrument from her earliest memory. And she had just spent 6 weeks in a house that was slowly, quietly, consistently demonstrating that fear was not the only possible operating condition. Damien appeared at her elbow. He handed her a water glass and stood beside her and looked out at the room. "How are you doing?" he said. "Fine," she said. Then, because fine had been her default for 20 years and she was trying to be more precise, "Better than fine. I'm okay." He nodded. "Constance Adler told me you were direct with her," he said. "Was that wrong?" "No," he said. "She hasn't had someone be direct with her in about 15 years. She looked genuinely delighted. Something moved through Lillian that might have been amusement, which was a feeling she was still getting used to experiencing without suspicion. She let it land. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Whatever happens, it will hold," he said. Not performed confidence. Assessment. The voice of a man who had spent 23 years learning the difference between the two. "Vern is good. Your statement is stronger than anything their doctor can put in front of a judge. The ER records that your father buried. I've had my people locate the originals. They're being submitted as evidence tonight." She turned to look at him. "You found them," she said. "The hospital's digital archive goes back 22 years, he said. Your father had the copies and the accessible records removed. The archive is different." He looked at her steadily. "It's all there, every visit, the original nurse's notes from the second one." She thought about a nurse who had looked at her arm too long and then looked away. "She documented it," Lillian said. "She documented what she observed," Damien said. "She also documented the conversation with your father in a way that, in retrospect, reading it now, makes clear she knew she was being managed." He paused. "She did what she could inside a system that made it easy for a man like him to operate." Lillian looked back at the room. "It should have been enough to stop it," she said. "Yes," he said, "it should have been. No comfort applied over the top of it. No reframe to make it sit easier. Just the agreement because it was true, and she had earned the right to have true things confirmed rather than softened." She drank her water. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For the records," she said, "for all of it." She paused, because the next part was harder to say, and she was going to say it anyway. "For the wedding night, the robe." She kept her eyes on the room rather than his face. "You could have done anything you wanted. You had every social and legal and organizational—" She stopped, started again. "Nobody had ever given me a choice before. That was the first choice anyone ever gave me." The room continued its golden hum around them. "You shouldn't have had to wait 20 years for someone to do the basic minimum," Damien said quietly. "No," she said. "I shouldn't have." She turned and looked at him now, directly, the way she could do now without the old reflex pulling her gaze down. "But you did," she said, "and it mattered." He held her gaze. Something in his face was different. Not different from its default, but different from the controlled stillness she had been cataloging for weeks. Something that didn't have a tactical function, that existed simply because it was there. She filed it carefully and said nothing about it, because some things didn't need to be named to be real. The courtroom the next morning smelled of old wood and recycled air, and the specific institutional stillness of a building designed to process human disaster with procedural efficiency. She sat at the respondent's table with Vern beside her, and her hands flat on the table surface in front of her, and her back straight. Across the aisle, her father sat with his lawyer, a man she'd never seen, expensive suit, the kind of face that was paid to look certain. Randall was in his best charcoal. He looked the way he always looked in formal contexts, composed, substantial, the picture of a man engaged in something regrettable but necessary. He did not look at her. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Harriet Caulfield, with the no-nonsense energy of someone who had heard every version of every story and had developed a finely calibrated instrument for finding where the performance stopped and the truth started. The petition was presented first. Her father's lawyer walked through it with the efficiency of a man who believed he was holding a strong hand. The framing of the marriage, the physician's affidavit, the behavioral evidence of a young woman whose responses to her environment indicated significant impairment. He was good. She sat and listened and acknowledged, internally, that her father had assembled something that would be credible to someone who only saw one side of it. Then Vern stood up. He submitted the hospital records first, all 3 visits with the original nursing notes intact, including the note from the second visit that described the attending nurse's observations in language that, read in the cold air of a courtroom 2 decades later, was as close to an accusation as a medical professional could put in writing without writing one. He submitted the social worker's original flag from the case file, not the follow-up report, not the closed case notation, but the initial flag, which had been filed with specific observations that had never resulted in action, and which, in the context of everything else now submitted, constituted a system's failure documented in its own paperwork. Then he said, "Your Honor, the respondent has prepared a personal statement that she wishes to deliver directly." Judge Caulfield looked at Lillian. "Ms. Hart Moreau," she said. "You may proceed." Lillian stood up. She had the pages in front of her. She had read them so many times in the past 11 days that she didn't need them. But she kept them there because they were proof that the words existed outside of her, that she had written them down, had made them real in a form that could be submitted and filed and preserved. She looked at the judge rather than at her father. She began at the beginning. She spoke for 22 minutes. She did not rush, and she did not editorialize, and she did not perform anything. Not composure, not distress, not the particular brand of feminine vulnerability that she had seen deployed in other contexts as a persuasion technique. She simply said what had happened, in the order it had happened, with the dates and the rooms and the words that had been said. She broke twice. The first time was when she reached the second ER visit. The nurse, the look, the looking away. Her voice went wrong for a few seconds, the way a road goes wrong on rough terrain, and then she steadied it and kept going. The second time was near the end, when she reached the conservatorship petition itself. When she described reading her own history described in her father's language, her survival responses reframed as symptoms, the evidence of what had been done to her repositioned as the evidence of what she was. Her voice dropped to almost nothing for a moment. She took a breath. She finished the sentence. She sat down. The courtroom was very quiet. She did not look at her father. She looked at the table surface in front of her and listened to her own heartbeat settle. Judge Caulfield took a recess. 45 minutes. Lillian sat in the hallway outside the courtroom on a wooden bench and drank water from a paper cup and did not speak. And Verna sat beside her and also did not speak, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him in 11 days of working together. He understood when silence was more useful than management. Damien was not in this building. They had agreed on this. His presence in a courtroom would have been a variable that neither of them could fully control. The implication of his organizational background, the way his name would sit in the room, the things her father's lawyer would do with it. His absence was strategic, and she had agreed with it, and she was acutely aware of the space where he wasn't. She thought about the bench in the garden he'd shown her 2 weeks ago. A stone seat at the far end of the grounds, in the section where someone, at some point in the estate's history, had planted climbing roses that had gone largely untended and developed into something wilder than intended. He'd taken her there on a Sunday afternoon without preamble, the first time he'd suggested they walk somewhere together, and they had sat on the bench, and he had told her the roses had been there when his father owned the house, and he'd never had them cut back because he didn't see the point of making things smaller if they wanted to grow. She had understood he was not entirely talking about the roses. The 45 minutes ended. She went back in. Judge Caulfield looked at both tables with the impartiality of a woman who had already made her decision and was performing the appropriate procedural beat before delivering it. "I've reviewed the submitted evidence and heard the petitioner's application and the respondent's statement," she said. "The petitioner has submitted a physician's affidavit describing behavioral patterns consistent with psychological impairment. The respondent has submitted medical records, a social work flag, and a first-person account that provides a documented, specific, and internally consistent alternative explanation for those same behavioral patterns." A pause. The behavioral patterns described in the physician's affidavit, hypervigilance, difficulty with authority, trauma response, are real. The question before this court is their origin and implication. Judge Caulfield looked at the petitioner's table. The submitted hospital records and the respondent's account establish a pattern of documented harm over a period of years that is consistent with those behavioral presentations. The physician's affidavit does not address, account for, or acknowledge this documented history. Another pause, shorter. The petition for emergency conservatorship is denied. Lillian felt the air go out of her. Not dramatically, not collapsing or overwhelming, just out, clean. The breath she had been holding in various forms for the past 11 days and in various other forms for the past 20 years, moving out of her chest and leaving a space that felt, for the first time in her memory, like it might eventually be capable of holding something other than bracing. Furthermore, Judge Caulfield said, "Given the nature of the documented evidence submitted in this proceeding, I am referring the matter to the district attorney's office for review." Her gaze moved to Randall Hart's table with the specific steadiness of a woman who had heard 22 minutes of a young woman's testimony and knew what she had heard. The record submitted today may constitute grounds for a separate criminal proceeding. That determination is not this court's to make. She looked at both tables. This matter is closed. She stood. The room stood. Lillian sat for a moment before her legs remembered that they worked. Her father left without looking at her. His lawyer moved briskly at his side, and she saw, in her peripheral vision, the set of Randall Hart's shoulders as he walked away, not the squared-back set of a man who has lost a battle and is recalibrating for the next one. Something smaller than that. The posture of a man who has felt the full weight of a structure he built come back down onto him, and who is leaving a room not as an exit but as a retreat. And who knows, at some cellular level, the difference. She watched him go. She felt nothing about it that she could name cleanly. Not triumph, not grief. Something layered and slow-moving, more like the feeling of a storm having passed than the feeling of having won a storm. Vern put a hand briefly on her shoulder. Professional, brief. The gesture of someone who understood the limits of their role and said, "That was extremely well done." And she nodded and stood and walked out of the courtroom into the hallway. The car was outside. Marcus at the wheel. She got in the back and the door closed and the city moved past the windows in its ordinary afternoon momentum, and she rode through it without needing to manage her face or her hands or her breath, just sitting in the back seat while the city moved around her, alive in the specific way that a city is alive when you are for the first time actually inside your own life. He was in the garden when she got back, not at the desk, not on the phone, not in the systematic motion of a man running an operation. In the garden, in a plain jacket, sitting on the stone bench at the far end where the wild roses climbed their untended pattern up the old iron trellis. She walked across the grounds toward him. He heard her coming and turned, and she watched his face read her from 30 feet away. The walk, the expression, the set of her shoulders, and she watched him understand before she said a word. She sat down beside him on the bench. The garden was quiet, in the way of outdoor spaces in late autumn, the air cold and clean, the light going golden in the way of late afternoons that don't have much light left to give. "Denied," she said. "I know," he said. Vern called. She nodded. "The DA referral," she said. "I heard. Will it go anywhere?" He considered this honestly, the way he considered everything. It depends on what the DA's office decides to prioritize. The evidence is there. Whether they act on it, he paused. Possibly. I have some thoughts on how to ensure the relevant people understand its importance. She looked at him. "Not coercion," he said. "Just context. I can provide context efficiently." She understood what that meant in the particular language of the man sitting beside her, and she chose not to examine it too closely, and she found that she was at peace with that choice, which was its own kind of information about how far she had traveled. "I sent a letter to the district attorney myself," she said, "this morning, before the hearing, in case the judge referred it." He looked at her. "Varna drafted it," she said, "but the words were mine." She paused. "I want it on record in my voice, not just in the evidence. I want there to be a file somewhere that has my name on it and says clearly what happened, and it's mine, and nobody can reframe it." He was quiet for a moment. "Nobody can reframe it," he agreed. The roses moved slightly in the cold air. Somewhere inside the house, the kitchen was producing the early sounds of dinner preparation, a distant domesticity, the ordinary rhythm of a household that continued its ordinary functioning through all of it. She thought about the girl who had arrived here 6 weeks ago in a wedding dress she hadn't chosen, with a fear that ran so deep it had stopped feeling like fear and started feeling like the baseline condition of being alive. She thought about her wedding night and the robe and the question of how old she had been, and the particular way he had not answered his own question, and what it had meant that he hadn't. "I didn't know," she said, "when I came here, what this would be." He looked at the garden. "I didn't either," he said. "You were expecting manageable," she said. She felt him go very still for a second. Then something in his posture shifted, and he said, "I was expecting a transaction," quietly. "That's what I arranged for." "Transaction? What did you get?" she said. He turned his head and looked at her. "Something I didn't arrange for," he said. She held his gaze. The garden held them both. The light was going the way light goes in late autumn, not dramatically, just slowly and honestly, the way things go when they're not performing anything. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I don't have somewhere to go. I have the financial arrangement. I have Verna. I have—" She stopped, started again. "I know what you offered me, that I could leave, that there were no consequences." She looked at the roses. I want to stay because this is where I'm not afraid. He said nothing for a moment, then, okay, I'm going to need things, she said. Not from you, things that are mine. I want to take some classes. I want to know what I'm good at outside of surviving. She paused. I want to be able to say when something is wrong without checking whether it's permitted. Yes, he said. Those aren't requests, she said. I'm telling you. Something moved across his face that she had no word for and didn't need one. I know, he said. The evening came in over the garden. The kitchen sounds continued their rhythm inside the house. Far at the edge of the grounds, the security rotation moved through its patient pattern, the lights coming on in the incremental way of a place settling into its nighttime arrangement. She sat on the stone bench beside the man who had looked at the evidence of the worst thing she had ever survived and felt something cold and steady move through him that was not pity and not strategy, and had not once asked her to be smaller or quieter or more manageable than she was. Her back ached faintly in the cold, the old scars doing their winter thing. She let it ache. She had spent 20 years trying not to let anything show. The aching and the scars and the reflexes and the 22 minutes she had spoken in a courtroom this morning. All of it, hers. Not her father's evidence, not his narrative, not the instrument of his control or the proof of her impairment. Hers. She had walked through rooms full of people with her back uncovered, and she had stood in a courtroom and said what had happened in her own voice. And she was sitting in a garden in late November with cold air in her lungs and a man beside her who had given her, on the first night of her new life, the one thing she had not known she needed most. Not safety, exactly. Safety was still new, still being learned, still sometimes confused with its absence by reflexes that hadn't caught up yet. A choice. He had given her a choice, and she had made it, and she was here. The light finished going. The garden settled into its evening dark, the climbing roses holding their shape against the iron trellis, growing the direction they had always been growing, untended and unhurried and considerably wilder than anything around them had planned for. She sat beside Damien Moreau in the dark and did not smooth anything over. She breathed the cold air. She was, for the first time, exactly where she had chosen to be. Not surviving the place she was in, but inhabiting it, fully, with all her history and all her scars and all the complicated living that had brought her to this garden and this bench and this man and this version of herself that she was still, every day, learning the dimensions of. The house lights came on behind them, warm against the dark. Neither of them moved. They sat in the garden until the cold made sitting there a choice you had to keep making, and they kept making it, and the night came all the way in, and the roses climbed their trellis in the dark, and somewhere in the city a man named Randall Hart sat in a room that was a great deal less secure than it had been this morning. And here, in a garden that smelled of cold earth and old stone, his daughter sat in the dark and was not afraid of the dark. That was everything. That was, in the end, the only thing that had ever needed to happen.